today because of that. That was in Indianapolis. Okay, we're looking at the nature of God. We really haven't gotten into the meat of our study. We have spent several weeks talking about positive arguments for the existence of God, and we're going to continue that probably through this month. I should finish up that part of the study by the end of this month, where we can get into a study of His nature a little more specifically. But we've looked at several classical arguments for His existence. We looked at the intuitional argument, the cosmological argument, the moral argument, teleological argument. And we'll look at a few more. One, which we don't always discuss, is the existence of man's free will in an indirect way is an existence for the proof of our God, is an argument for the existence of our God. The Bible itself is proof of His existence. We'll look at that too. Today I want to look at what is called the aesthetic argument, which is sometimes seen as a part of the teleological argument. And why would that be? What is the teleological argument again? Yes, the argument from purpose or design. The aesthetic argument is that argument from the existence of beauty, of value. Therefore, when you see something that's designed and has purpose, there is value. There certainly can be beauty. You could also look at this argument as a subset of the moral argument, where there is value, there is morality, there's that which is upright and good. But we're going to kind of take it separately today. And we see it being discussed more and more. Darwin recognized, and you recall his book, it had a long name. We usually cut it off at The Origin of Species, but it was a much longer title than that. But he admitted in his book that if things are created just for the sake of beauty, for variety, then that is fatal to his theory of evolution. Why? Why? Yeah, what is the benefit? What is the benefit of just having things that are beautiful or attractive to the survival of the fittest? In fact, in his book he says that really with natural selection, the only thing that evolution can do is produce those things that injure other species, not benefit other species. Everything you do in life is to benefit yourself. It is survival of the fittest. It is a dog-eat-dog world if you are an evolutionist. And so it's not about benefiting others. It's not about evolving traits that benefit other species. So this becomes a problem when we start talking about aesthetics, beautiful features. Darwin didn't really know how to handle that, so he just kind of speculated that, they probably just accidentally happened, or perhaps they had some function in the past which they no longer have. He didn't really answer the problem. Atheists today have recognized that that's a problem, and so they've tried to come up with some pretty pathetic arguments. One argument they come up with is when they look at animals or the animal kingdom. They'll say, well, beauty obviously could be used as far as attracting mates. Okay. Okay. Let's follow that line of reasoning. If beauty was designed just for the purpose of attracting mates in the animal kingdom, then after millions and gazillion years of evolution, what should we have? Only beautiful animals, right? Only beautiful things should have evolved by now. We shouldn't have ugly ones. And I'm not going to get into what's ugly and what's not, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But we all recognize there is such a concept. And so why would you have anything that was ugly? Why wouldn't have all the ugly animals died out by now if the genes were only passing on beautiful traits because that's how they survived? Why isn't this animal kingdom more beautiful? Why have these ugly creatures been around for a long time and continue to be around? Now the Bible, of course, is consistent in its explanation of ugly things. Ugly things came from Genesis chapter 3. What happened? What happened in Genesis chapter 3? Sin entered the world. The genome was forever corrupted and began to deteriorate. Our genes are deteriorating more all the time. This world in which we live is deteriorating all the time. I suspect men and women of the antediluvian world, that is before the flood, were bigger, stronger, faster. Kind of reminds me of the Bionic Man. Remember him? We can build him bigger, stronger, faster than we are now. And they certainly lived to be almost 1,000 years old. As some of you old folks used to say, they had a pretty good constitution, right? You lived 969 years like Methuselah. Now, sin entered the world, and they no longer had access to the tree of life. Things start to deteriorate, and it really speeds up in deterioration after what sin brought what upon the world? No, death was already here. What did sin ultimately bring upon the world that caused a speedier, the flood? After the flood came, look at the ages of men, how they dropped, after they exposed to much more ultraviolet radiation and other things. And so, the Bible is consistent on these things. Atheism doesn't really know how to answer it. But of course, here's the problem with that. Sexual selection doesn't work unless you have what in the first place? What has to be here before you can start weeding it? Well, the beauty had to be here to begin with. So again, the question becomes, how did beauty get here? It's like we always say when it comes to evolution. Evolution talks about the survival of the fittest, but it never explains the arrival of the fittest. Do you have something you want to say? What's that? Right. Yeah, and that is the problem. I mean, let's face it. Hitler's whole philosophy was based upon atheistic humanism, evolution, Hegel's theory. I mean, that's where Hitler got his theories from, and that's what evolution you would have to teach if you believe beauty has somehow evolved. Yes. Sure. Well, I mean, it's a matter of, yeah, and as we've mentioned before, it's a matter of choice. We'll talk about that, because they also, if you take atheistic evolution to its logical extreme, you actually have no choice. But they do have a choice. They have a choice to decide whether they're going to ignore the evidence or not. And of course, they choose to ignore it because they don't want any constraints upon their behavior. But here's the problem. All that we've talked about is only touching the hem of the garment when it comes to aesthetics. In other words, all they're talking about is one little area, and that's what? Yeah, animals, creatures. But that's not that is not even close to covering the whole topic of beauty and why it exists. And what I mean by that is, there are a lot of things in this world that we consider valuable and beautiful that have nothing to do with animals or creatures. For instance, that doesn't explain why I appreciate an ocean view, a mountain vista, a beautiful waterfall. It doesn't explain why we find beautiful pieces of music to move our emotions, or a poem, or a good book. All of the areas that we call the fine arts, a beautiful painting, why do we find these things to be attractive or beautiful? And so therefore they're kind of missing the point, because it's not just the fact that there are beautiful things, but the question is, why do we perceive things as beautiful? That's the question. Animals don't do that. Why do we regard, and I realize beauty, as we say, is in what? The eye of the beholder. And so what constitutes something that's beautiful varies from person to person. I understand that. I may find a particular piece of classical music beautiful. It may stir my emotions. You may find it not very beautiful at all. But that's not the question. We all know that, we look at things differently, but the question is, why do I appreciate it at all? If I'm just an evolved animal and there is no God, then I submit to you there is no such thing as beauty and there's no such thing as value. Because it is tied into not only the design, but the moral argument. And so that's what we really need to talk about with a little more specificity. I did a little research on this. And I've got a lot of good quotes here from various people that have talked about this topic. For instance, the powerful nature of fine art and beauty. I like what one writer said, that we look up at the stars. What does it make us do? When you look up at a starry night, it fills you with a sense of what? Smallness. Sometimes people say it fills me with a sense of wonder and awe. And what is that driving me to do? What is the message there? What is it telling me? When I have those feelings of smallness, or feelings of wonder, or feelings of awe as I look out at the heavens, then what does that make me start thinking about? Absolutely, that there's something beyond me. Again, beauty has that way of making us feel that way. Evoke a sense of longing in the human heart that can't just be satisfied with physical things. Thomas Aquinas said, "For there resides in every man a natural desire to know the cause of any effect which he sees, and thence arises wonder in men." And so man is struck by the colors, the patterns, the intricacies, the mysteries that he finds in the world. The reason there's beauty is because we serve a God of beauty, and all of these things, design and beauty and value, point us toward Him. Another writer said, "The present world really is a signpost to a larger beauty, a deeper truth." Now, you're all familiar with C.S. Lewis, who was a pretty large figure in what we would call religious or Christian writing. He was at one time an atheist. And he said, "The books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them." Now listen what he says. "It's not in them. It only came through them, and what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images of what we really desire, but if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshippers. For they are not the thing itself, they are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited." What he's saying is, when I walk this earth and I see beautiful things, if all I can do is worship those things because they're beautiful, if that is the end of my inquiry, then I've missed the whole purpose of aesthetics and of beauty, because that should be pointing me where? To the one who created it. He says, "We do not want merely to see beauty, though God knows even that is bounty enough. We want something else which we can hardly put into words, to be united with the beauty we see," and so forth, to become part of it. Humanity has this desire to connect with what is beyond and outside of itself. The beauty found in the world points to a world beyond and helps us understand the feelings and emotions that are running through our hearts and our souls and our minds. And certainly those kinds of things stir your emotions. And they should get you to be thinking about something that is beyond yourself. That is something atheism and evolution can't explain when it comes to the human heart. And so an atheist is forced to live as if beauty has meaning when really, in his philosophy, it has no meaning, really. If there's no God, it has no meaning. There's no objective truth, no goodness, nor beauty, nor value if God does not exist. For the purpose of fine art is to stir up in emotions and cause us to think. And that's why we see it under this topic sometimes of the design and purpose argument, the teleological argument. Does the Bible have anything to say about beauty? What does Genesis chapter 1 say? Every time when God would finish something in His creation, He said it was good. That Hebrew word can actually be translated, and isn't translated in other places in the Bible as beautiful. It has value. In fact, I think it's the same word that's translated when Isaac, and it said Rebekah was, the Bible said Rebekah was fair. Now here's God's word talking about a woman who was fair, beautiful. And so what about the temple? What about the tabernacle? Think about the design, the ornateness that God put into it. Right? Let's look at a few. Actually, turn back to Genesis chapter 3, and we'll look at a few passages. It's interesting to me, the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and it was what? Pleasant to the eyes. Pleasant to the eyes. And a tree to be desired. No animal ever said, man, that tree is pleasant to the eyes. Right? They don't have that capability. They can't appreciate that kind of thing in nature. Let's look at a few passages. Let's go over to Psalms. We'll look at a few there. Look at Psalm 27. 27. That's what I just said. Psalm 27. 27. I hadn't said that yet. 4. One thing I have desired of the Lord, that will I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold what? The beauty of the Lord, and to inquire in His temple. You see, without God, there's no such concept. Turn over to chapter 50. That's a 50. Well, can't get my pages to work. Let's see. Look about verse 2. Out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God will shine forth. Turn over to chapter 96. Look at verse 6. Honor and majesty are before Him. Strength and beauty are in His sanctuary. Does God concern Himself with beauty? Turn over to Ecclesiastes. Actually, Proverbs comes first. Let's go to Proverbs. Proverbs 24. Let's see. Look at verse 13. This is interesting. My son, eat honey because it is good, and the honeycomb which is what? Sweet to your taste. Now let me ask you this. Where does this concept come from? Sweetness. Did you know, why is it that we desire things sometimes that are bad for us? You ever like to eat something that's bad for you? Why? Because it tastes good. For the most part, and I know there's, on occasion you can get a cat that's pretty finicky. But for the most part, my dog wouldn't turn down anything. You put it in front of him, he'd eat it. Why is that? I mean, I don't care about that. Where do these concepts come from? Like sweetness, sweet to the taste. What about a good smell? Now, dogs like rank smells. The ranker the better, as Alan would say.
Greg, have you ever thought about the fact that the colors around us in nature never clash? The fall, the summer.
Yeah, you never look at nature and say, boy, he sure wasn't looking in the mirror this morning when he left. You've seen people, they'll put an ensemble together and you're like, man, what was that person thinking? Never have that problem in nature, do you? That's right. What else would grass be? I mean, let's face it. When I turn on my TV and I watch Boise State play football, I think, man, that is the ugliest football field I've ever seen. Why? Who paints a football field blue? It makes no sense. Let's turn to Ecclesiastes. Sweetness, that's an interesting concept. Look at Ecclesiastes 3:11. And that's interesting. Now, keep in mind what we've been talking about. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, He has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. Now, what have we been saying? The beauty that surrounds us should, whether it's the beauty of nature or the beauty we find even in the things that man does, the fine arts, those things are designed to stir our emotions. They touch us inside, our innermost feelings. And those things, again, should cause us, we're looking for something. We're looking for something to fulfill us. And what does this verse say? He has made everything beautiful in its time, and He has set eternity in their hearts. It again should cause us to think more about those things that are spiritual. Because again, in a purely naturalistic material universe governed by dog eat dog and atheism and evolution, there would be no such thing as this if there's no God. Remember, it can only injure others, never for the benefit of others, and never certainly to cause me to think about spiritual things or things beyond me, things beyond just this physical existence. And yet that's what these kinds of things do. Turn over to chapter 11 of Ecclesiastes. Look at verse 7. No, that's not it. What am I looking for? Yeah. Truly the light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to behold the sun. Again, animals don't get up in the morning and think, man, it sure is such a beautiful sunrise. But we do. Turn over to, let's see. Look at Ezekiel. This is a good one. Ezekiel 33. Look at verse 32. Indeed, you are to them as a very lovely song of one who has a pleasant voice and can what? Play well on an instrument. For they hear your words, but they do not do them. talking about a lovely song, a pleasant voice, one who can play well on an instrument. Some of you may have this weekend gone to see Phantom of the Opera at the Orpheum. In a purely materialistic universe, you couldn't enjoy that. You wouldn't enjoy the melodies, the sentiments, wouldn't arise any emotions in you. But for the fact that God exists and has put these kinds of things within us to appreciate. Because He appreciates beauty. Look at Song of Solomon 2. We were talking about things that are sweet. Somebody find, let's see, go back to Song of Solomon chapter 2. Look at verse 13. The fig tree puts forth her green figs. The vines with the tender grapes give a what? A good smell. Enjoy a good smell? Psalm 34:8, taste and see that the Lord is good. What about the New Testament? Does the New Testament ever talk about beauty? What's beautiful? What's beautiful? Yeah. What about the feet of those who carry the gospel, glad tidings of peace? So you see where this is pointing. When you start talking about things that are absolutely beautiful, and we can all have our opinions as to what's beautiful in the physical realm, but when it comes to that which is absolutely perfect in beauty, the Lord says it's things like taking the gospel to other people. It's things like self-sacrifice. Absolute value and worth. Was there value and worth in the sacrifice of Christ? Absolutely. In fact, we're to conform our lives more like Him each day. That makes us beautiful when we behave the way He behaved. You ever heard somebody say, well, that person sure has a beautiful spirit, a lovely spirit? Yeah, because that person is being molded into the image of His dear Son. And so, again, aesthetics would not exist without a God who appreciates those kind of things and puts something within us to make us wonder and awe and to stir our emotions in order us to get us to think more deeply about who we are and where we're going. Any questions or comments about that?
A lot of what you've touched on is the beauty in concrete things.
Mm-hmm.
What about the abstract? The beauties of heaven that we've never seen but described in such an amazing fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, again, the beauty in the material that we see, I mean, even that is not, I mean, again, when you start talking, and that's why I said the evolutionist can only talk about or try to conjecture as to why there's beauty in the physical realm. But he still never gets to talking about why there are aesthetics when it comes to things that have to do more with our inner personalities and our feelings and our souls. That's why he can't talk about why is there beauty in a poem or a book or a piece of music. That stirs us within. And it's the same thing with God's Word. It stirs us from within and helps us to seek those things which are of greatest value. And certainly, and it's interesting when you start talking about beauty and aesthetics, God has described heavenly things, spiritual things, by comparing them to material things. In other words, he talks about, streets of gold and gates of pearl, because that's what we're familiar with. But we all know when we get to heaven, they're not actually going to be actual gold. There's no need for actual gold or actual pearl or any of that kind of stuff. He's trying to help us to see the spiritual beauty that's going to be there. And certainly the most beautiful thing that we will set our eyes upon is the Godhead itself. The glory and the majesty that will be there. Any other questions or comments about the aesthetic argument? Run that by me again. Well, it won't be any less beautiful after a... Well, I can't even use that term. I can't even use the term years. You know, there's a song that, right, says, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. The fact of the matter is, you're not going to be there for 10,000 years. There is no such thing as time in eternity. So, that will not be an issue. Well, what's the opposite? What would you say the opposite then would be of aesthetics or beauty? Things which make us feel good. What's the opposite? Right, things that are ugly. And I'm not talking about physically ugly. What's the number one... we do need to touch on this just a little bit. What is the number one argument? Number one argument for the atheist against the existence of the God of the Bible. Yeah. Yeah, the existence of evil, pain, and suffering, as we sometimes call it. It's their number one argument. Or that what they consider to be their most powerful argument. And what is the argument anyway? Somebody lay it out for me. What's the argument? All right, the Bible teaches that God is perfectly good. We sometimes use the term omnibenevolent, right? Omnibenevolent. He is all good. Remember, the rich young ruler came to Jesus, said, "Good master." Jesus said, "Why are you calling me good? If you're calling me good, then you must be admitting that I am God." Do you understand what you're saying? Do you understand that you're telling me that you believe me to be deity? Because only deity is absolutely good. So God is all good. He's omnibenevolent. That is a perfectly scripturally consistent position. The atheist says your God is all good. And you also claim that your God is what? He's all powerful. Right? What's the word for that? What do we use? We'll talk about these more. We'll get to these particular topics down the road. But He is omnipotent. He is all powerful. So you claim to worship a God who is all powerful and all good, and yet evil, pain, and suffering exist in this world. Therefore, it is our position, the atheist says, that He is either not all powerful, because if He's all good, He'd want to do away with all that. Or, if He's all powerful, He's not all good because He can and won't get rid of it. Now that's their position. Evil exists. How do you explain it? So, we want to take this in a logical progression. Yes?
I was just going to say that when God originally created everything, it was good. Whenever He created, man, man was uncorruptible. Man was perfect. When He created the earth was incorruptible. The reason why evil, pain, and suffering exists because of those same people that are accusing God of letting evil, pain, and suffering come into the world. It's because of sin, we decided to let that in. Because whenever sin entered the world, evil, pain, and suffering came in as well. Fairness and beauty left.
Well, certainly death came into the world. I don't know. I don't want to get into this philosophical discussion of what, because it's not all these questions are answerable. First of all, when God created the world and put Adam and Eve in the garden, did gravity exist? What would have happened if Adam would have violated the law of gravity? Even before he ate of the fruit. These are questions that philosophically people talk about. We're not going to get into that in here. In other words, was there animal death before man ate the fruit? Did he step on a bug? I'm not trying to confuse you. But what I'm saying is, I don't want to get too far afield on, because that is one reason But it's deeper than that. It's deeper than that. First of all, you have to understand that when an atheist starts talking about evil, he can't logically talk about evil anyway. Okay? Don't let him do that. Why? There's no such thing as evil if there is no God. If there's no ultimate standard, if you're just a product of evolution, then you're just doing what your genes tell you to do, which is survive. Okay? So there is no such thing as objective evil if you're a true atheist. There's no ultimate foundation for ethics. We already talked about that in the moral argument. So, you can't really talk about the problem of, quote, evil. Let me read you another quote from C.S. Lewis. As he was making his journey from atheism to theism, he said, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust, but how had I got this idea of just and unjust? If you're an atheist, a man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too, for the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple." A theistic apologist by the name of William Lane Craig, I think, summarized it pretty good when he said, "I think that evil paradoxically actually proves the existence of God. My argument would go like this. Number one, if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Number two, evil exists. Three, therefore objective moral values exist. That is to say, some things are really evil, therefore God exists. Thus, although evil and suffering at one level seem to call into question God's existence, on a deeper, more fundamental level, they actually prove God's existence." So if evil actually exists, and there are some things in the world that are not as they should be, and you know that that's true, some things are good and some things are bad, then this atheistic assumption is false. So, atheists will usually, when they're talking this way, come up with some kind of emotional argument, and it'll go something like this. When I walk into a children's hospital like St. Jude or Le Bonheur, then I know that God doesn't exist. That's the emotional argument. Why is that? Why would He allow all these sick children to suffer? You say, well, again, that becomes too simplistic. Because when I walk into a children's hospital, depending on my perspective, He sees a bunch of sick children. What do I see? I see the love and the concern and the comfort of parents, of volunteers, of doctors, of nurses who are doing all they can to help these children. And in fact, if I go in there and take a survey, more than likely the vast majority of people that are parents of these children and volunteer to work in these hospitals are God-fearing Bible believers, more than likely. They're not atheists. And on top of that, if we really live in a world of materialistic atheism and evolution, survival of the fittest, what should these parents be doing? If they're just animals, they should let these kids die, because they're either not going to be able to pass on the species, or if they do, they're just going to have more bad children, more children with defects, more worthless people that we should be getting rid of. And you say, well, that's cruel, but that is exactly what these people are teaching. That's why they abort babies, and that's why they're now trying to get, assisted suicide, and sooner or later they're going to want to put in a law like they have over in some of the European countries now, that if you're on your deathbed and you're just not worth anything to anybody anymore, we'll just kill you. Sure. Survival of the fittest. I don't know, but you're not an animal. I don't know. Some animals eat their young, but I don't eat mine. So, here's the problem for the atheist. Pretty soon he understands that he can't really talk about evil. Because if there's no God, there's no such thing as evil. So he changes the terms, the definition, to suffering, pain, or harm. He gets rid of the term evil. Because, let's face it, well, we'll get to the biblical definition in a minute. And so what he says is, well, there's just too much suffering, harm, pain in the world. Well, so are you telling me then that a loving God would allow no suffering at all? An absolutely loving God would allow no suffering in the world. Let me ask you this. Is it cruel to just take a healthy baby and take a needle and just jab him with it? Is that cruel or not? Absolutely. You'd never do that. You wouldn't take your perfectly healthy baby and stab him with a needle just for the fun of it. But suppose this baby has a terrible disease he's dying from. And you need to give him this injection of some life-saving vaccine or cure. Is the baby going to enjoy this needle? Is the baby going to appreciate you and thank you for sticking him with a needle? No. Are you going to do it anyway? How do your pets react when you take them to the vet? Do they understand it when they get their shots? Do they appreciate it? Do they say thank you? No, they yelp and they holler and they bark and they don't like it. But you do it because it's good for them. So are you saying that absolutely no suffering should be allowed? Let me ask you this. Somebody leaves an eye on the stove. Would you want to be able to just come along and lay your hand on the eye of that stove and just leave it there without knowing, without feeling any pain? Is that the way you'd want it to be? Just leave it there because, see, I don't have any nerve endings in my hand because God's an all-loving God and He wouldn't want me to suffer, right? Wouldn't want me to feel any pain. So now I have no nerve endings in my hand. So I'm just going to lay it on the eye of that stove. What's going to happen to my hand if I leave it there and just leave it there? Eventually, I'll have a hand that I can't use. But because I have nerve endings in my hand, when I touched that hot stove, what did I do? I pulled it away as quick as, my reflexes would allow me. So is it correct to say that a loving God would not allow any suffering? Well, no. They finally have to admit sometimes a little suffering is necessary for the greater good, right? So, we'll pick up here next week, but their next thing then is, well, I can't talk about evil, and I can't say that all suffering is bad, so now the atheist resorts to this. Well, there's too much unnecessary, pointless suffering. But we'll talk about that next week. Who decides what's pointless and unnecessary? We'll talk about that next week.